Dear viewers, with SpaceX's IPO, a tangible peace agreement between the US and Iran, and the first Fed press conference featuring Kevin Warsh, a sense of positive euphoria is building in the markets. However, this enthusiasm hasn't quite spilled over yet when it comes to Bitcoin and altcoins. In the next few minutes, I'll be talking with Oliver Michel from tokentus about what's exciting right now, how things might unfold, how the indicators are behaving, and whether we're currently at the start of a potential rally. It's great to have you here, Oliver.
Hello.
I just said it. SpaceX, the easing of tensions with Iran, and then tomorrow, the Federal Reserve's first meeting with Kevin Warsh at the helm. As great as it is, and of course we've seen that Bitcoin has surged, the kind of euphoria we've already seen in the US markets, for example, hasn't quite spread to Bitcoin and altcoins yet, has it?
Yes, that's right. So since last Tuesday, our last interview, Bitcoin has already gone up, but only moderately. And yes, this wave of all-time highs, which is essentially being driven by the major US indices, has definitely not yet spilled over into our cryptos, but I'm pretty sure that will still happen. But perhaps, Johanna, until then, we might still have to expect this final capitulation, which we also want to talk about today, how far it could go, when it might happen, and how the whole thing might play out.
You're talking about a break below that level, possibly even down to $60,000. We'll take a closer look at that on the Bitcoin chart in a moment. But first, let's start by looking at the Fed Watch tool, or rather, at market expectations for the Federal Reserve. We already received the US inflation data the week before last, followed by the US jobs data last week, and as I've already mentioned twice, Kevin Warsh will be presiding over the Fed meeting for the first time this week and will also lead the press conference accordingly. Interest rates will likely remain unchanged. But first, the big question is, of course, what do you expect from Kevin Warsh at his first meeting?
Yeah, it's just like you said. So the interest rates probably won't change. You can see this here in the Fed Watch tool, which reflects the market's view of interest rate trends. On June 17th, tomorrow, Wednesday, rates will remain unchanged through the end of the year, and the market anticipates a possible rate hike at the beginning of 2027. You already said it, Kevin Warsh will take office tomorrow as the new Fed chair. He certainly can't do much yet, make moves, take action, but he can talk. He can talk specifically at the press conference. It's his first press conference. And yes, he can use this opportunity to make his mark on the whole situation, set the direction, position himself, and, as they say, make a good first impression. And that's what I'm actually counting on. And after the great SpaceX IPO and the peace agreement, as we'll see in a moment, is the third great story, or rather, the third highlight we've had to report on these past few days. I have high hopes for it.
Expectations were high and have certainly been met, if not exceeded, regarding the SpaceX IPO last Friday. It was oversubscribed 4 times over. Investors waited several hours for the opening price. Then the stock rose nearly 20%, followed by another 19% gain yesterday, Monday. That means we saw, just a moment ago when we last checked the charts, that a gain of over 10% is also on the horizon in pre-market trading. That means we'd already been above the $215 mark today. This has made Elon Musk the first trillionaire, and many who said this would just spike briefly and then come crashing down on Monday haven't seen that happen so far. Now, of course, people are watching closely to see how this whole thing plays out, how euphoric it is, since there's a great deal of AI hype surrounding this company and how it all unfolds. But right now, the mood really leans toward euphoria, or a positive outlook for the future. We saw a scaled-down version of the same thing with the US-Iran conflict. It was yet another, what felt like the 12,000th announcement from Donald Trump that a peace agreement between the US and Iran was in the works. However, it has now also been confirmed by the other side. That means we have 60 days, another 60 days of a ceasefire. the Strait of Hormuz has been reopened. We saw the immediate impact on the oil price, which fell back slightly, and the plan is to sign this agreement this coming Friday the 19th, but it's not final yet because the nuclear issue is to continue to be discussed during these 60 days of the ceasefire. Still, it's at least a step forward compared to what we've seen so far. Here on our Crypto Insights channel, we've also already answered, or rather, you've answered, the question that came up from our community regarding the Bank of Japan and its interest rate meeting. If the Bank of Japan raises interest rates again, which it did last night from 0.25% to 1%, it could of course negatively impact the carry trade if one takes a short position there, but ultimately US and Japanese interest rates aren't yet aligned to the point where arbitrage trading would be negatively affected. So in terms of momentum, as you always say, Bitcoin and the altcoins will rise if the market conditions allow it. In that regard, the underlying situation is actually positive, if it weren't for the fact that the US inflation data might look a bit different upon closer inspection.
Yes, that's right. So, as you already mentioned, there's one highlight after another, and I hope we'll see another highlight tomorrow with Kevin Warsh. But of course, as we've said many times before, he has a difficult legacy to live up to. On the one hand, the legacy of Jerome Powell, and on the other, of course, what Donald Trump has basically dumped right at his feet, namely the Iran conflict, which along with energy prices has simply driven inflation up. And you can see that here. Last week, CPI and PPI inflation data for May were released. The CPI data, in March we had 3.3%, in April 3.8%, the forecast for May was 4.2%, and the actual figure was 4.2%. So going from 3.3% to 4.2%, that's actually quite decent. And those are the consumer data. This is the producer data, the stage one step earlier in the chain. After all, what the producer produces must eventually be consumed. And here you can see that in March we had 4 zeros. After a revision, that is a correction, we had 5.7 in April, the expectation was 6.4, and the actual result was 6.5. Of course, that was quite a shock last Wednesday. And similarly, of course, there are also the core figures, that is excluding food and energy, which are naturally significantly lower because energy isn't factored into the price. But still from 2.8 to 2.9 and from 4.9 to 4.9, those aren't huge increases, but we're at a pretty high level, and that's something Kevin Warsh and his team will have to deal with. And that's ultimately also the reason why we're likely to see an interest rate hike here, precisely to combat this inflation at this point. But maybe Kevin Warsh has a few brilliant ideas that give him a reason to perhaps move in that direction after all. Or if he comes up with a few positive statements, well, it's enough if he finds positive statements that the market picks up on and then translates into corresponding gains in the indices or price increases for our cryptocurrencies.
In any case, we'll have Kevin Warsh's press conference tomorrow. I remember we used to talk so often about Jerome Powell's press conferences and even joke a bit about how boring the whole thing was. What do you expect to hear tomorrow from, or rather from Jerome Powell, from Kevin Warsh at the press conference? Can he single-handedly turn things around with his words, or at least pave the way for what's to come in the future?
Well, there are these 3 stages. The first stage is the interest rate decision. We'll see that then. The second stage is the press release. That is the press statement that is published. That is certainly also approved by the Fed's Board of Governors. But the part where he's on his own is the press conference. And during that press conference, various questions come up. And then, Johanna, it all comes down to how he answers those questions. And that way, he can already put his own personal stamp on the whole thing without having to coordinate with the various other board members who may not necessarily share his opinion.
Jerome Powell, for example.
Among others, he's also on the board, but there are a few others as well. Well, it's set to launch tomorrow. And I hope, believe and think that it will go quite well, and that along with SpaceX and the US-Iran conflict, it should be another highlight, especially for our markets in the US.
As for the markets in the US, this coming Friday the 19th is not only the scheduled date for the signing of the peace agreement between the US and Iran, but it is also a holiday in the US because on June 19th, 1865, it was on this day that the end of slavery in Texas was officially signed into law. This is a holiday that is still relatively new, however. It was only proclaimed under Joe Biden as Juneteenth Day on June 19th. So it's a long weekend in the US, but we'll still have our hands full since the crypto markets run 24/7. Let's take a look at the US indices. We usually started with the Nasdaq. Now you're starting with the Dow Jones. Why is that?
Yes, for me, this is the most important slide in our interview today. As you already said, it's not the opening on the Nasdaq, but the opening on the Dow. The Dow, that was the last major correction on the way up. Here, that was the slight correction we've always seen in tandem with the Nasdaq. And yesterday, the Dow hit another all-time high, so it's clearly leading the way. And why is this slide so important? We are in a very important phase, and during this important phase, it is important to get a feel for the timing and the sequence of events. And the best way to gain that insight is to look back at the past. And here, I'd like to use the bursting of the dot-com bubble as an example. After all, we've been talking a lot these days about the bursting of the AI bubble. Back then, we also saw the bursting of a technology-driven bubble. So in that respect, it's quite comparable to the dot-com bubble and the AI bubble, unlike the great financial crisis, that is 2007, 2008, and 2009, where the focus wasn't on technology, but rather on capital and real estate. What happened back then? The timeline was as follows. Back when the dot-com bubble burst, the Dow Jones reached its peak in January 2000. The Nasdaq peaked in March, on March 10th, 2000. S&P and Russell peaked in mid to late March. So here you can see a clear sequence. It started with the Dow, then we moved on to the Nasdaq, which was considered a technically more challenging index at its peak. And then, after the Nasdaq had peaked, reached its highest point, the focus shifted to the S&P and the Russell. In other words, the Nasdaq reached its final all-time high, well ahead of the S&P and the Russell. People here talk about the classic, I've written it down here, rotation effect, which we always use that term at the end of a bubble. First, the tech sector cracks in the sense that it gives way, and then the rotation shifts toward broader value-oriented indices like the S&P and Russell. That's exactly what we've been describing time and again. And we have to be very clear, Joanna, at the end of the day, our cryptocurrencies ultimately belong in this group of broader value-oriented indices, the S&P and Russell, in this peer group. That's the order. And if you break it down chronologically to see what happened back then, the timeline spans roughly 2.5 months, during which the Dow peaked first, followed by the Nasdaq, and then the S&P and Russell. And I expect a similar sequence to play out again now. As a result, the first thing we need to look at is, what's the Dow doing? The Dow is already in the range of new all-time highs. It will certainly continue to rise for quite some time, but if it starts to falter, then the next thing we need to watch is the Nasdaq, which is comparable to today's AI stocks. And the moment it starts to tip, we'll still have 2 or 3 weeks, just like back then. Then the rotation will shift toward the broader indices, and then our cryptos will finally see a massive surge. That doesn't mean there won't be a surge beforehand, but the real big pump leading up to the peak, that's when it will happen. So there's a clear sequence here, even within the US indices, and at the end of that sequence, our cryptos will ultimately follow. So we have to wait. It doesn't all happen at once. That's actually the key information. That's the sequence, and that's the time frame. So when the Dow peaks, it doesn't mean the Nasdaq will do so the next day, followed by the Russell and the S&P the day after that. Rather, it's a gradual process that unfolds over time, and referring to the last slide, we need to keep an eye on how it all plays out step by step.
For now, however, the fantasy and hope surrounding AI are still very much alive. We saw that with the SpaceX IPO. We're also keeping an eye on the upcoming IPOs such as Anthropic's. So this hope, and to put it bluntly, this sensationalism surrounding AI is still very much present. And of course, we're seeing that on the NASDAQ as well.
Yeah, you said it yourself. The successful SpaceX IPO is creating a wave of euphoria, with the offering 4 times oversubscribed. Retail investors are rushing in, while institutional investors are already starting to pull back. Did you subscribe? I'm already up 50%, and, well, that's exactly the kind of euphoria you need. Then, of course, there's the easing of tensions in the US-Iran conflict, meaning that energy is getting cheaper and the oil price is falling. All of that is now giving Kevin Warsh a fresh tailwind, and from that perspective, I can definitely see it. After all, we have the NASDAQ here. That was the correction we had been talking about. And the question arose, is this correction enough? And we had said in the channel that we had seen the counter movement. Last Thursday and Friday, those are the 2 lower green
candles.
And we said that if you subtract 1 here and 0 here, then you can see that you have the important retracements here. 6, 1, 8, 7, 0, 2, 7, 8, 6. And I'd also mentioned in the channel that the upward trend continuation will happen exactly when another green candle appears that essentially runs through these retracements. And we got that candle yesterday, so given that we were up 3% yesterday, we can assume that we'll see an upward trend continuation, and that this correction will therefore is expected to be largely complete. That means we're moving forward now, and the Dow is peaking, the Nasdaq is peaking, following the minor correction, which is expected to be complete. We're now in the final leg before the final high, and that final high certainly won't be long in coming. If you look at the RSI, it's already on its way up again. Yes, it will be interesting to see how things develop here over the next few days and weeks, with a target range between 30,000 and 33,000 points. We're very close to that.
The entire market environment right now is full of positive news, which we've already mentioned several times. We also saw that following Bitcoin's sharp correction, its price has risen again, but that this euphoria is still a long way from taking hold in Bitcoin and altcoins. That means we now have a bit of room to grow again. However, you've also mentioned the risk of a correction below $60,000 in past interviews. How do you assess that risk at the moment?
50-50.
That it'll drop back down to the high 50s.
Yeah, or that, I mean, it's always that kind of question. Can it go up or down? We always want to look at both sides of the issue. What are the possibilities? The first point is quite clear. The Dow is performing well. The NASDAQ is performing well. The S&P and the Russell also posted good results yesterday. And our coins, especially Bitcoin, are slowly trending upward. And as we just said, only once capital starts rotating out of the NASDAQ will massive amounts of capital flow in here, and then we'll see a huge surge upward. At the moment, however, it looks like this. Last week we said we were down here in this range and would move sideways for a few more days. That was the original statement from last Tuesday, and that's exactly what happened. It moved sideways with a slight upward trend. And there are just these 2 possibilities right now. Last week, we also estimated the support range to be between 55 and 60,000 based on this.
Yes.
Cheers to the 21st, and thanks for the support on the 24th. So that's why I still think it's going down. Forms a first wick here, goes up, misleads investors, and then goes down again into a second wick that's slightly lower than the first before it finally goes up. With this movement here, you might have to do some math. Of course, it's also possible that things will go straight up. But Johanna, that doesn't matter at all right now, because both paths will lead upward. I can't imagine it going any lower while the Nasdaq, Dow, S&P and Russell are racing from one all-time high to the next. and at some point money will start flowing out of the AI sector and nothing will come in here that would push this whole thing higher. So from that perspective, whether we go straight up now or have another little dip to shake out the last of the nervous investors, the path leads upward, and that will take us into the range of the 50 and 100-week SMAs. Those need to be taken into account. And then, of course, the area of the 3 major retracements. I assume that if we really do enter a relief rally, as it looks right now, then we'll end up right in that area, between 100 and 110. It could rise here and then potentially turn downward. That would be a relief rally, and if things go really well and there's a lot of momentum and the Trump administration really disproves all the lies and keeps pushing the whole story forward, then it could continue as a continuation rally toward 140 or 150. I still haven't written them off. So, as you asked at the beginning, the question for me too is, will we see a final capitulation after the first one or a second one? And when will this rotation take place? The Dow, the Nasdaq, and then across the board to our cryptocurrencies. So, from that perspective, we're still in a sideways trend as of June 16th, and we're still trying to answer the question, are we forming a bottom now? The routes down are described. We can cross the first one off the list. It's out. The second scenario is the one that's still up for debate, 50-50, and then we'll definitely be heading higher. Option 1, a relief rally. Option 2, a continuation rally. And this is the schedule for the next few days and weeks.
Of course, we always take a look at the weekly chart as well, since the weekly chart is a bit more decisive for Bitcoin. And here we also have the RSI and MACD indicators. How have they changed over the past week?
Yeah, I've actually been waiting to finally be able to draw this. Here's the thing. What we always see is the bearish divergence between the RSI and the price. The price is rising and the RSI is falling. And at some point, this has to tip over so that in principle, this divergence is satisfied. We've always had this vertical line here and said it has to break above it. And what you can see now, it's very clear here, is this bullish divergence. That means we have an RSI that's rising and this red line, the price, that's falling. And that's a very clear bullish signal. And this short-term bullish divergence, short-term as opposed to long-term, could certainly lay the groundwork for the uptrend that will then take hold here with or without a test of the high 50,000s. Here with the MACD too, it hasn't turned into the red zone yet. So from that perspective, in terms of the indicators we are always watching, the foundation is pretty solid. And last time I also drew in this purple arrow here and said I could imagine this area being roughly comparable to that one. And here too, you can see that the price is falling while the RSI is rising. So back then, just like now, we had a short-term bullish divergence, and after that, the price went up nicely. And that's exactly what I'm actually expecting to see again here in terms of how the RSI and MACD are playing out. That's what we're seeing here as well. Yeah, we were below the zero line. Man, the two lines were getting closer together, and you run to the right and go up.
We also touched on Bitcoin dominance again in our last interview, and it's currently on the decline. In other words, Bitcoin dominance is falling. Has the situation developed to the point where we might now be seeing slightly more positive expectations for altcoins?
Yes. You can. We have here the Bitcoin dominance in the weekly chart. That's what we've been including in the weekly chart ever since we started tracking it. So it starts from way down at the bottom, made its way down here initially, then went through this very long sideways movement, which is something we've always observed at this point. And that's why I've zoomed out a bit here. You can see that now on the right. So that's this area. And you can see very clearly how the dominance dropped significantly over the week before last and then slowly started to rise again. I actually thought it would do a back test here, this range, and then drop further. But over the last few days, Bitcoin has picked up steam again. But you can see, for example, on a day like yesterday, that's the red candle. When XRP and ETH, the number 2 and number 3 coins on CoinMarketCap, were really performing well with gains of 5, 6, 7 or 8% in some cases, Bitcoin just couldn't keep up. It only manages 1 or 2%, and then on days like that, you see a red daily candle developed. And that's exactly what we want to see here at this point when it goes down. One possibility is that Bitcoin is falling more sharply than the altcoins. That's not really the scenario we want to see. We want to look at the scenario where the altcoins rise, but Bitcoin doesn't rise as much as the altcoins. That's also one reason for a downward move. And that's, for example, the day before yesterday. And well, you can really see very clearly that there's this downward trend right here, which you notice. And I can well imagine that it's going up now, and then it should start going back down soon. Namely, exactly when the altcoins start rising faster than Bitcoin.
Altcoins have also performed well during this relatively positive week. We'll take a look at Ethereum and XRP, and starting with the number 2, we'll begin our weekly and daily overviews here as well.
Yeah, I put that there so people can see the bigger picture and also really get a sense of what the day is like. The key point in this whole story in the weekly chart is the strong support level at 15 US dollars. It formed here and held here. That's already a very, very important development. When it comes to ETH in terms of the RSI and MACD, we're not as far along as we are with Bitcoin. As you can see here, a bullish divergence hasn't formed yet, and the MACD is slightly in the red, so there's still some catching up to do here, and you can see the 2 green weekly candles. Things have moved a bit, but we're still very close to that strong support level, and it's quite clear, Joanna, that the moment that 50% level kicks in, which suggests we'll take Bitcoin back up into the high 50s, then that red line here will definitely be tested, and hopefully we won't dip significantly below it, and if it does, then only by a tiny bit before it quickly bounces back. So from that perspective, we're still far from out of the woods. We'll have to keep an eye on that, but nonetheless, here you can see the daily candles from the last few days. So yesterday it was 4% here, and ETH was also up between 5 and 6% at its peak. That's already quite a few. The whole system is supported in a similar way to Bitcoin. Strategy bought yesterday, or maybe last week, something like 500 Bitcoins for 100 million. And also Bitmain, Tom Lee's company, has also bought 135 million, and they're now holding just under that amount. And that's the goal after all, 5% of the ETH supply. So that's an interesting story in itself. They're staying on top of it. They're buying up these days. And with XRP2, the whales, those who own over 1 million XRP, are buying up massive amounts, adding to their positions on a very consistent basis, and we can see that here as well. The fear and greed index is low. We've said that before too. It's also a pretty good indicator when you're asking yourself, should I buy now? Yeah, when the fear and greed index is low, well, it's always a pretty good opportunity. And if it really turns out to be true that we're staying in this range and the price is set to rise from here, then you've caught the ideal entry point, the perfect time to buy more. But there's still cause for concern because the abyss at the red line is quite obvious. If we go below it here, then there's nothing there at first.
We'll talk a bit more in detail at the end about the excitement or the jitters, especially when it comes to investors, and also your personal opinion. In the meantime, though, let's take another closer look at XRP. What's it like around here?
Yes, here again we have the weekly chart and the daily chart. It's a similar picture. 2 green weeks, which is already a pretty good start. Last week I had identified this strong support level between 91 and 93 US dollars, analogous to the 1500 US dollars for ETH. We haven't achieved that yet. Of course, that would be something XRP could capitalize on in the event that Bitcoin drops again. We have to expect that. Of course, if, and let's be clear, it doesn't drop down into the high 50s, but instead rises steadily from here on out with the goal of testing the resistance level at 80 a second time, then it'll go up here as well. There's absolutely no question about that. And you can see that here in the daily chart too, the upward trend is evident here as well. So really great days. Yesterday, we saw gains of as much as 8 or 9% in XRP. We haven't seen that in ages, days when we had those kinds of percentage gains. Nevertheless, XRP hasn't benefited from this DTTC XLM announcement as it stands here. Normally the two move in sync, but we'll see in a moment how XLM has pulled ahead. XRP is still lagging behind. But I found a really interesting statement that I'd like to share. Bitcoin and XRP are the only cryptocurrencies that have remained in the top 10 by market capitalization without interruption since 2014. So in that sense, we're talking about a truly well-established coin here. And another highlight when it comes to XRP is, of course, what we've been covering here for weeks. Last week's spot ETFs. Bitcoin has seen an outflow of 315 million. Compared to the 2 weeks before that, when we were in the billions, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, that's obviously a massive recovery. ETH also saw an outflow, Solana saw an outflow, but for 8 or 9 weeks in a row without interruption. Despite these downtrends we had, you just have to realize that. That was the downtrend, and right in the midst of that downtrend, we had every week a positive inflow. So from that perspective, that's a great achievement. And yeah, now we need to build on that as far as XRP is concerned. One more thing about the Clarity Act, just to wrap things up. As far as this blog is concerned, the clock is ticking, as we already mentioned last week, and it's now ticking at an alarming rate.
Right.
So there isn't much time left to get the Clarity Act onto Donald Trump's desk. Once it's there, he'll surely sign it right away. We've been working on the history of ethics this past week, so who in the political sphere is allowed to do what? What is ethically acceptable here? Security issues were also discussed, so everyone is trying to get everything done as fast as possible because it's clear to everyone involved that this is necessary. Because if you can't get it done, you'll have to wait years. And well, there are already people, insiders, who say, well, about July 4th, a signing ceremony on Independence Day, which...
That's going to be close.
That's actually almost impossible, but you don't necessarily have to do it on July 4th. There are surely still a few days after that when it's doable, but time is running out. And obviously, coins like ETH, XRP, and whatever else they're called, they'd certainly benefit from something like the Clarity Act in a positive way. But I think, and we've discussed this on our channel, that even if the Clarity Act doesn't pass, it's not the end of the world.
But let's talk about XLM again. For the third time in a row since the positive news about the partnership between XLM and the DTCC, we now also have XLM's chart with us. As you just mentioned, XLM has significantly outperformed XRP, has made up some ground, but has also pulled back with the recent correction, though not all the way back to where it started. What do you expect to happen here?
Yes, that's the daily overview, the one we included last time too. That was the DTCC announcement, which some of you might still have in the back of your minds, and within 3 days, the whole thing shot up by 100%. So there you go. That shows what's possible, but then it came back down again. So profit-taking clearly. It didn't quite go back to where it was, but when it came to XLM, we wanted to clarify one thing, because that's a key question that comes up again and again. Yeah, but my coin has great news and all that. So why isn't anything happening with it? Can XLM decouple from the rest when everything else is going down? We've already given that answer. It's all about the market environment. If the market environment is right, Johanna, then that's great news. Are having an effect, and this effect is then reflected in a price increase. We had a great market environment yesterday. Yes, the US, Iran, then the SpaceX IPO, and then the prospect of Kevin Warsh on Wednesday. We had a great Monday, and you can see how, on that day, with a great market environment and great news, the price moved, and at one point yesterday, we were up 25%. And that's the point I just want to keep reminding everyone of. News alone doesn't move prices. The news has to coincide with a favorable market environment, and then prices can go up. And of course, this applies just as much to Bitcoin as it does to XRP and ETH. There's already a huge amount of good news behind all these coins, just waiting for a clearly positive market environment, and then our market could also skyrocket, following the Dow and the Nasdaq when it comes to market breadth.
We're going to discuss once again the phase we've already talked about several times, namely the tension phase, though it could also be called the build-up phase. We don't have a roadmap with us today, not because we want to hide it, but simply because there's nothing new to report as long as we continue to have to exercise patience. By phase, I mean, as you've often pointed out, and as was just mentioned in relation to bubbles, such as the telecommunications bubble, for example. And that naturally created a lot of excitement. You're caught up in this euphoria, we just talked about that. Companies are going public, the excitement is there, and you expect it to keep going like that, and then suddenly the whole thing is over. When you draw these parallels, for example, to the dot-com bubble or the telecommunications bubble, does that stress you out? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Don't stress, it's more like a certain kind of tension. Just a quick note about XLM. I think our viewers have gotten the hint. It's a great coin that's going to catch on. And when you look at the chart, you just have to ask yourself, when would it make sense to get in? When should you get in? When is it reasonably safe? And because we're now entering a phase where you can make up a lot of ground, but you can also lose a lot. And that creates a certain amount of tension. The ones I'm sensing, and I don't want to stress out the viewers with this sense of tension, but I'm just going to tell it like it is. I've pointed out so many times that this phase was coming. This phase where the Dow is pushing toward its peak. The Nasdaq is following suit, the market is broadening, and the rotation is shifting into our crypto sector. Cryptos are staging a relief rally. That's all coming up now. And what's coming, liquidity is shifting from the Nasdaq to the broader market. We described this in detail today in connection with the Dow. I already mentioned last week that stories like SpaceX, those kinds of extraordinary events, usually coincide with the peak of a trend. We saw that with AT&T Wireless, which was spun off at the peak of the dot-com bubble. That was the biggest IPO of its time. And UPS in November '99, also just before the dot-com bubble burst, a massive IPO, and shortly thereafter, just 2 months later, it was all over. I'm not saying that the IPO itself signals the peak right now. Rather, it will certainly continue for a while longer, and then we'll see the first wave of sell-offs. And we saw it with Coinbase, how they were pushed up and then ended up almost back at the opening price. And that's what's going to happen to us here too. And then after all this euphoria, a certain, let's just say it was relaxing, but well, it wasn't all that great. And then things start to take off. You start looking for other exciting and interesting things, and that's when you branch out into, among other things, cryptocurrencies. And this phase we're now entering, as it stands here, requires, in my opinion, the most attention. We're talking about a period of 3 to 4 months. So it's not a matter of this week, next week, or the week after that. Rather, this process, starting with the Dow and ending with the high in our cryptocurrencies, is one that spans several months. But in this process, you have to take a position, possibly make additional purchases, possibly buy in at one point or another, and make sensible decisions accordingly. Catching the right moments. We've discussed this before, including on our channel, how to trade Tau, and when the ideal time is to buy more. So once the retracements are over, you're on the safe side. I can only advise everyone to do the same, even if he says he's been saying that for a year and a half. What I've been saying for the past year and a half is that we have to keep an eye on the Dow, we have to keep an eye on the US indices, because they're leading the way and the rest are following behind. And at this point, and there's no denying it anymore, we are heading into a parabolic trend, with the major US indices hitting one all-time high after another. The AI market is overheated. There will be a correction, and that will be our opportunity in the crypto market. And in my opinion, that's when you really need to be on your guard, stay alert, and be ready to sell after all.
Have you restocked yet?
I did say that I'd buy more XRP, I'd buy more XLM, and I'm going to buy some Canton products. Those are the three. So I'll buy Canton New and I'll buy more XRP and XLM. And if you go back to the XLM page, then you can see that was number one. That was the zero. That's the downward move. And then here you can see the retracements, 6187027886. That means the moment XLM comes in here.
Yes.
When trading the major retracements, there is of course a chance that you'll be rejected. Bitcoin has dropped to the high 50s, and it's either going down or about to go down, depending on the situation. I'll buy more as soon as the three major retracements have run their course, because then I'll know that the trend that has been emerging here will continue accordingly. Those are the moments I'm waiting for right now. The same applies, of course, to XRP, and ultimately the same applies to Canton as well.
Once we're allowed to buy more Canton shares, at the very latest, things will naturally take a turn for the better, and next Tuesday we'll discuss what's already happened, as well as what's actually in store with Kevin Warsh, the upcoming press conference and the Federal Reserve meeting. For now, I'd like to say thank you for today, and I'm looking forward to Tuesday. Dear viewers, of course, we're looking forward to seeing you next Tuesday as well. We'll be bringing you all the important news and, on top of that, pulling a few late-night shifts to cover the World Cup, which, as you know, is being played at times that are sometimes rather ungodly here. Accordingly, we'll naturally be keeping an eye on the cryptos 24/7.